We're also going to have a look at how they want to migrate Hyper-V VMs running Windows and Linux operating systems to Azure IaaS VMs. And then we're going to have a look how they do that for physical machines. So they can also migrate physical machines running Linux and Windows to Azure VMs. So there are a couple of requirements Tailwind Traders has, which we're going to have a look at and which we're going to discuss in this session. So first of all, how can Tailwind Traders see the dependencies between different servers and machines and applications running on their on-premises virtual machines and physical servers? We're then going to have a look how they can migrate VMware VMs to Azure. We're going to then actually have a look on how they can migrate Hyper-V virtual machines to Azure. And we're going to discuss how they can actually migrate on-premises virtual machines, on-premises physical servers to Azure. Now, but last but not least, we're then also having a look at, like, for example, file servers, and we're going to show you how they actually can migrate file servers to Azure virtual machines with some special tooling we have there to do that. Now, before we start with that, I want to quickly talk about the different motivations and triggers which are there if you want to do migrations. And we can see a lot of different requirements there, or the different triggers, if you will, why people want to migrate. And again, they can be like data center contracts expiring. They kind of want to meet like more modernization, application innovations. They don't want to do a software or hardware refresh on premises. They want to take advantage of the cloud. And one thing I want to highlight, really, you can see that in the right corner there, software is end of support. So as you all know, we have, for example, end of support was already announced for Windows Server and SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2 already a couple of months back, if you will. So these operating systems do not really get security updates, except you buy extended security updates, and then you can still have them running on your in your infrastructure. However, again, those is not usually very cheap, so you actually spend a couple of your budget on this. However, one of our offerings is if you migrate your Windows Server 2008 or 2008 R2 and as well as SQL workloads to Azure, you will get 3 years of extended security updates for these machines for free. So this will then give you enough time to actually upgrade these applications to a newer operating system or modernizing them on, for example, PaaS services. Again, this is not something I would recommend doing for okay, let's just migrate them and wait 3 years. This is really okay, we migrate them so we get some more time as well. Now, I also want to highlight, if you're, for example, looking at products like Azure Stack HCI, you can also have Azure Stack HCI in your data center and migrate your 2008 and 2008 R2 servers on that. And since this is basically then Azure, you will get also these extended security updates as well. So let's talk about our migration experience and how we actually do migrations. Now, again, there is much more involved than just having a tool to migrate the VM, right? We actually need a little bit more. And here we see actually the migration process, if you will, and how that looks like. And it's about tooling, it's about guidance, it's about having partners and tools available to help you with that migration. Now, we're going to have a look at these 4 different steps. And again, I will not say that these steps are just like in one specific line. It also is like something you start from the beginning when you do that migration process. So for example, of course, you start with an assessment, right? You want to know, can I move my virtual machines to Azure? What does it cost me when I move them there? What are the dependencies? How I actually need to do that. Then we have the migration process. This is actually where we actually then move the servers to Azure or the applications to Azure. And then we obviously, when they're there, we not just want to leave them there. We usually want to go out and optimize them to make sure that they're configured in the right way, that probably some of them can be run more efficiently. And we also want to make them more secure and actually manage that in the right way. And so governance and security is a very big role, not just at the end, but also like to build the foundation, right? Build the fundamental Azure infrastructure with like the right architectures, governance in place, security, and all of that. Now, again, as also mentioned, there are a couple of different tools which we go run through, but I also want to quickly highlight a couple of solutions and programs we have. For example, the Fast Track for Azure program, where they have a scenario to help you actually migrate workloads to Azure. And this is a free service you can actually go out and check out as well. And then if you build your Azure environment, I also want to quickly highlight the Cloud Adoption Framework, and I will talk a little bit about the end about that, because this will then give you some guidance on how to not just do migration, but then also operate workloads as well. So when it comes to assessment and migration, we are offering a tool called Azure Migrate. This is basically your hub where you actually start your migration projects, if you will. And Azure Migrate can do a couple of awesome things. It's an agentless solution to migrate Windows Server and Linux servers. Again, we're not just focusing on servers, we're also doing, for example, databases and app services as well. For the servers, they can run on VMware, Hyper-V, or on physical machines. We support SQL and non-SQL data migrations, web app migration to Azure App Service, and also migrations not just from your on-premises environment, but also from other cloud providers. So if you run your services at other cloud providers, you can also move them over to Azure using Azure Migrate. And then obviously, we also integrate with third-party solutions. So we are having like different solutions for assessment or the migration part, where third-party solutions actually add added value and added features to the Azure Migrate platform. So again, coming back to actually that timeline, it's like picking the right tool for the right job, right? So when we're looking at, for example, the assessment part, then we have a look at Azure Migrate assessment, where we can actually look out how that works. There's also tools for databases and data migrations. And then when we have a look at Migrate, we, for example, again, have Azure Migrate. We also have then integration with, for example, the Azure Database Migration Service or the Azure Data Box, which allows you to actually, when you to move your data, sending a box, a physical box of data, basically to an Azure data center. When you have like bad internet connectivity, or you have a huge amount of data to move that, and you don't want to do the initial replication basically over the internet, you can actually send your data using that service. And then obviously we also offer tools for the other processes, like when it comes then to optimize and the optimize and secure manage process. So you can actually go out and use Azure Cost Management to figure out, okay, what is actually causing a lot of cost, how can I reduce costs, but then also with Azure Advisor, which is a free service, which also helps you to actually figure out, okay, which service can I optimize? Like, can I optimize security? Can I optimize how that service runs? Can I optimize costs? So you can have a look at Azure Advisor. And then obviously we give you a lot of different tools when it comes to then securing and managing your environment with Azure Security Centers, policy, monitoring, and much, much more. And again, as I mentioned before, we also integrate ISV solutions, third-party solutions, to really help you with your migration journey. And I really want to highlight that because a lot of you probably have already experience with these third parties doing other migrations. And again, they can also integrate into our Azure environment. So let's have a look how Tailwind traders, what we're actually going to have a look at this and what we actually going to do in this. So first, let's have a look at Azure Migrate when it comes to the assessment tooling. Azure Migrate, again, can help us to actually discover our compute environment and also discover dependencies between that. So it allows us to discover VMware VMs, Hyper-V VMs, physical servers, AWS instances, or Google Cloud Platform instances. And these assessments, again, as I mentioned, we have obviously our Azure Migrate first-party tool set to do the assessment, but also we integrate with third-party workloads to actually help us and adding other like values and other options for our customers. And some of them are free options, and other than you pay something to our third-party vendors. So the assessment part, really, I want to quickly highlight that again. It's really done for, in this scenario, we're looking at the compute instances, and you actually can say, okay, are they ready to run in Azure, or are there certain limitations? How will the sizing be? So it will take advantage and have a look at the virtual machine size, but not just necessarily for the virtual machine size, but also for how is the virtual machine running. If it doesn't have, if you monitor that VM with Azure, with the Azure Migrating Assessment tool over a couple of days or weeks or months, Azure Migrate will actually say, okay, your virtual machine is, for example, size too large, right? On premises, sometimes you just assign a size to the VM. However, it doesn't even need that size, but you're not going to size it down. And that obviously then doesn't need the same size in Azure. So Azure Migrate will actually recommend you the size that virtual machine actually needs, which can then help you to reduce costs as well. It will then do a cost estimate on the virtual machine on the Azure VM size and actually tell you how much the cost will be. And I remember doing that before we had the Azure Migrate services with a large spreadsheet with all the servers and then mapping the different sizes of VMs and then actually calculating the cost. So this tool will really help you with all of that and will generate some nice charts as well. So if you need to go to your manager or your board to actually tell them how much it will cost, Azure Migrate will be a great help. And then again, as I told you, it will not just have a look at a single VM. If you want to, you can also discover dependencies across different servers. It will then help you about like, okay, how do I optimize that? And then obviously group your different VMs together for the migration, right? So you don't have like, okay, half of the application migrated to Azure and the other half still staying on-prem just because you didn't know about it, which then can have an impact, for example, on performance. In some cases, again, that's fine, but in some cases you really want to have the whole application or all the servers which are working together migrated together. So this is an example of the discovery. This is how that can look like. So you can see here, for example, I have my servers and the processes on that machine and some more information, and I can see how they connect together. And then I can see, okay, through which ports and endpoints is that server connecting to. So let's have a look at how we can discover and assess Hyper-V VMs. Now in this demo, we're going to have a look how we can really start our Azure Migrate project. And for that, we are here already in the Azure portal, and we're going to have a look and build our new migration project and actually figure out how we do the assessment of our environment. So for that, let's open Azure Migrate. And let's start a new project here. So this will be our new migration project. We select a subscription, we select a resource group and provide a name for this migration project. In this case, we call it Migrate Hyper-V VMs. And then we can also choose the location for where the metadata is stored. Again, this is not for necessarily for where it's stored, but where we migrate to, but where the metadata is stored. We can then select what do we actually want to migrate. So in our case, Hyper-V VMs. And the first step we need is actually a appliance, which will then do the discovery and assessment of our VMs. So for that, we provide a name for that appliance. And then we need to generate the key because we need that key later to attach that appliance to our Azure Migrate project. So I copy that key and save it in OneNote. And now I can download this appliance. Again, I can download a VHD file here. I can also download a zip file, which can help me in doing the installation on an existing server. But with the appliance, actually, we can start that here. So here is the appliance. I can extract that. And it's nothing else than, in this case, obviously, a Hyper-V VM. On VMware, it would be a VMware VM. I can now go to my Hyper-V manager, and I can actually go and import that appliance VM. So I will just run a normal virtual machine import, the path to the virtual machine. You can see it found it, change it that it creates a new unique ID. And then it will tell me and ask for where I want to store it. Obviously, I select the location where I run my virtual machines. So it will copy that virtual machine at the destination and will tell me that I need to select the right virtual switch. And just click on finish. This appliance needs obviously connectivity to Azure. So it needs to connect to the Azure, to the Hyper-V host as well as to Azure. So we start up that appliance, and on the first startup, it will show us a couple of information we need, like, for example, to accept the license terms here. So read and accept the license terms. We'll need to set a local administrator password for that appliance. And after that, we can actually log in. Now you can see here we already have everything installed. It will run a couple of scripts at the beginning, and then we can actually start our browser. And here is the portal actually of this appliance, and it will do a couple of checks like connectivity to Azure, for example, and if you have the latest updates. And now we need to register that appliance to our Azure Migrate project, and that is the key I just copied before. So I copy that in and I go to login. I will now also need to sign in into my Azure environment. So I copy here the code for the login. Select my account with the right permissions, sign in. And now I can close that window. Now this will do the configuring of that appliance from this project. You can see here that it's now successfully registered. And now I will need to add my local credentials for that specific environment. So I can add here, for example, Hyper-V host. So I provide the username with the right permissions for my Hyper-V host with a password, because that is one we're going to use later on to do the discovery. So I'm going to save this. And again, I can add multiples of these different accounts. And then I want to add, obviously, the sources I want to add. So I can add a single item, or I can also add a group or a cluster to it as well. In our case, we're just going to add a single host here to make it simple. Click on save. And now you can see here the validation is done. It checked if we can access that VM. And now we can actually trigger and start the discovery. So now we can actually go back to the Azure portal. This will take a moment, and then we can go to the next steps. You can see here when we have done that, we can go back in our project, and if we do a refresh, it will show us that we now have servers discovered. So after the refresh is done, you can see here now it discovered 3 servers. And what we're going to do here now, we create an assessment with that data. So we're going to select the assessment type. We can then give that assessment a name. So you can do different assessments, do different times, for example. And we can do some additional configuration here as well. And now we create a group of servers we actually want to use. You don't have to use all of these. So because Tailwind Traders named them all with planet names, we call it planet servers. Luckily, they did not name one of them Pluto. So we create an assessment. And this will now take that data we sent to Azure and creates the assessment with that data we have there, right? Until now, we only dealing with metadata. Nothing has been migrated over to Azure yet. But we can actually now look at the assessment here. And you can see here, this is one of them we created. And you can see here, all of the VMs are ready to be migrated to Azure. We can see the estimated cost for compute, but also for storage. We can also have a deeper look at, for example, the Azure readiness. You can see here that our servers are all green, which is great. You can see here it took different Azure VM sizes. You can see here the operating systems, and you can also have a look at, for example, like if it's a BIOS or generation 2 VM and so on. It also picks the Azure VM size again, not just on the size of the VM, but also on the history of the performance data of that VM. Again, right now it was a very short time, but it could be that it actually then discovers smaller VM sizes when we have more data, right? So I highly recommend that you let that connection run over this discovery run over a couple of days or weeks or even a month to get actually better data out of it. And then you get different sizes for the Azure VMs, for example. And here you can also then get the monthly estimated cost separated by compute cost and storage cost, so you can actually see that. And then obviously you can do different measurements. Like if you're then surprised that one VM takes so much storage cost, actually doesn't need that much, you can then go and optimize that as well. So that was the discover and assess Hyper-V VMs. Again, this also works obviously in a similar way for VMware VMs as well. So you can now migrate your servers. Again, we're offering third-party tools with Azure Migrate, but again, we also integrate with, for example, with third-party tools from different partners and vendors, which then allows you basically to migrate VMware, Hyper-V, or physical workloads, or even machines from other cloud providers. We are supporting Windows, Linux, and Unix operating systems, and we have agentless and agent-based options depending on what your needs are. And then we have, again, as I mentioned, some of them are free, some of them are paid solutions. The Azure Migrate one, the first-party one, is usually free, so you can just use that to migrate that. So how do we now migrate these VMs if we would be Tailwind traders? So first, we need to actually deploy the Azure Migrate server migration tools on the Hyper-V environment on the specific hosts. So we're going to have a look at that. We're going to then discover and migrate the VMs and assess the dependencies. That said, we can also use the assessment we just did, right? So there are multiple ways of doing this. So if you want to use the existing assessment, you can also do that, or you can create a new assessment for your migration project. We then start the replication for the VMs. So it will do the initial replication of these VMs. Again, here you will be basically needing some time until everything is replicated, depending on your internet connectivity. But if your internet connectivity is very, very low, you can also use tools like Azure Data Box to migrate large bits of data. And then we will do some testing for the migration. We can do that like before we actually migrate the VMs, we can actually do a test of the migration. And then at the end, we will do a full VM migration. So the VMs are actually migrated from Hyper-V VMs to Azure VMs. So let's have a quick look at the Migrate Hyper-V VMs demo. So here we are back in the Azure portal. You again see our Azure Migrate project. You see that we still have our 4 servers discovered, our group, and our assessment. Now, if we scroll down, we can actually go to migration tools, and we can actually go and discover that. So again, we can choose where is the source. In this case, again, it's a Hyper-V environment. So we need to prepare our Hyper-V hosts. So for that, we're going to download a credential file together with a installation file, which we'll then use to register our Hyper-V servers. So for now, we only had the migration part, the assessment part, and now we are actually preparing for the migration, right? So we're going to install the Azure Site Recovery Provider, if you will. That's the tool we use in the background to replicate. We select the key file we just downloaded. Again, this will then register our Hyper-V server to the right Azure Migrate project. And this will then take a couple of seconds to complete. Registering the server. And let's do the finish. And now we can actually go back to the Azure portal, and after a while we can then click on finalize registration and actually confirm that server. And then when that is done, we can see the registration is now finalized. Now this Hyper-V server is basically prepared. And we can now go out and, for example, do a new discovery and a new assessment if you want to. We can also create a new group. So we're going to create for this, we're going to create a new group. So we decided to create a group called Migrate to Azure, where we actually can go and say, these are the servers we want to migrate. Again, we can also use an existing group from assessment before. So let's create a new one here. And now we can go further. We can create a new assessment based on that data. Again, we can then also choose the assessment type. Right now we want to do Azure VMs, but obviously we can also do other solutions as well. We create a new assessment name. Again, we can also configure the different target locations. We can change that. And now let's use the group we just created, and let's create a new assessment. Again, this will now go out and use the same performance data and create a new assessment. What we're going to do now is we want to create a new replication to actually start replicating these virtual machines. And then we can actually take an assessment we just created. So we just select the group and we created the assessment we just created. And now we see all the VMs here, which are part of that assessment. And again, we can still decide here if we just want to do 2 servers or 3 servers, but we're going to do all of them now. And now we need to configure the target settings. So we need to select the Azure subscription, the Azure resource group, a replication storage account. We need to select the virtual network these servers are going to be connected to. We select the subnet for them. If we have the Azure hybrid benefit, we can also do the licensing differently. And now here we configure the VMs itself. So right now we, for example, the OS type, but you can also see here we could change manually the sizes of these VMs if we wanted to. And now we can also select the disks of these servers which want to be replicated. If we don't want to replicate all of the disks, we could change that, and we can now just click on replicate. So now this will take a moment, and we can go on the overview, and you can see here that the replication has started, and you can see here that in our case now 2 of the VMs already replicated. The third one is also now replicated. Again, with the magic of video editing, this is a lot faster than probably it is in real life, but again, for sake of the demo. So now we go and say we want to migrate these servers. So what it will do, it will shut down the local servers. It will replicate the latest changes, so you don't have any data loss. And then it will do the failover basically, or the migration to Azure, and it will create the Azure VMs, join them to the specific virtual network until they're over. So now, when this is done, we can actually go to our Azure virtual machines. And now you can see here, I have here my 3 Azure virtual machines running, which I just migrated from on premises. And you can see how easy and fast that can be. Again, in real life, you probably want to run the assessment for a longer time. Also, the replication obviously will take a little bit more time until these virtual machines are like replicated and have the protected status. However, when you do the failover, it will only replicate the latest changes. Again, it will shut down the VM, replicate the latest changes, which is in a small amount usually, because it's continuously replicating data from these virtual machines, and then you can go and do the failover. What I mentioned before, if you want to do a test before you actually want to migrate these, you can also go and do a test. In that case, the on-premises VMs will still keep running, and we will create some VMs in an isolated network, so you can actually go out and test how they are running on Azure, and then you can just clean up the test when you're done, and then you can say, okay, everything works, so I go now and do the real migration like we just did. So this was the demo about migrating Hyper-V VMs. Now, we can also migrate VMware workloads, as I mentioned before. And we can migrate them to Azure VMs, the same thing as we did with Hyper-V VMs, or we can also migrate our VMware workloads to Azure VMware Solutions, which allows our customers basically to migrate their VMs to running VMware in Azure. And then again, you have a couple of steps here where you can go through as well. Now, again, depending on where you want to run it, it really depends on your scenario, right? If you're, for example, like really fast, need to move all your VMware workloads outside of Azure, and you don't have enough time to, for example, train your staff with Azure, so you want to keep taking the advantage of the skills they have already. Azure VMware Solution is a great place to actually migrate your on-premise VMs to. So again, there are different scenarios you can do, but all of them is basically supported by Azure Migrate as well. You can also, as mentioned before, migrate physical servers. In this case, you also again have an appliance which will do the replication for you, which is called the configuration server. This will then do actually the communication between your on-premises environment and Azure and manages the replication of the data. And then you have a process server, which then is basically a function as a replication gateway. Again, this can do multiple things. You just, again, for all of these replications, you actually need to have connectivity to Azure available. So we talked about now migrating compute workloads in terms of virtual machines and physical servers. However, some of our workloads maybe are good to be migrated to a new server itself, right? And one of them is, for example, file servers. So what we have is the storage migration service, which came new in Windows Server 2019, or basically with Windows Admin Center. So it's part of Windows Admin Center, and it supports the possibility to migrate file servers from one place to another. So if you want to migrate your on-premises file server running on 2008 or 2 to, for example, a Windows Server 2019 running on-prem, you can use the storage migration service. However, you can also use that to actually migrate these workloads to Azure, right? And make it simple. And there we can use Azure FileSync. We can migrate to Azure FileSync, for example, or we can migrate it to an Azure VM running on Azure IaaS. So we're not just supporting, obviously, Windows file servers, we're also supporting clusters and even Samba shares and even NAS appliances as well. So what we're going to show here is what we actually can do. So what does the storage migration service do? And again, I will show you a demo in just a bit. So it will do an inventory of the existing file server and file shares. And we obviously then will need to provide the name and the IP addresses, DNS, and so on. And then it will go out and check all of that. Like we will see the local users and groups, for example, and permissions, which are attached. We can also do that with, again, Linux file servers using Samba or NetApp appliances. We then, in our case, since we want to migrate to Azure, we create a new Windows Server 2019 IaaS VM as a file server in Azure directly from Windows Admin Center. We will then start transferring the data and replicating the file shares as well as the files and folders to that Azure IaaS VM. And then obviously the migration would not be just done with that. We will actually take over the identity of the existing server, so we take over the name and so on for the new VM, and rename the old or the original file server to a random generated ID, because again we cannot have both at the same time. So that is what we're going to have a look at in the storage migration service. So let's start with the demo. So here we are back in Windows Admin Center, and what we're going to do, we start with the migration. So we go back to the storage migration service, and you can see here I create a new migration job. I'm gonna name that job Cloud File Server Migration, and again this is we start with a Windows server or cluster. And so this will then, that wizard will help us. You also see all the supported scenarios. So we will do first, we need to have the credentials we're going to use to log into the source server. And then we can do some additional configuration. And then we can actually go out and add that server here. So we give that name or IP address of that specific server. So you can see here we are now connecting to that file server 1. We add that server. And we can now go and actually start a scan and do that. And so this will then really, as you can see on the bottom here, you can see here then it will discover the shares, it will discover the configuration of that server. So you can see here we can all find these shares, which we have here. And now we go to the next step, which is actually transferring the data. So now we need to have the credentials for the destination device. Click next. And now we can select, okay, we want to have an existing VM, or we want to create a new Azure VM directly from the wizard. So we're going to do that. So we're going to select the subscription and the resource group where we want to create that VM. We provide that VM a name. So this one is currently obviously different than before because we don't have the same name in the same network and the connected network. So we can then select the region and we can select the operating system. So on the Windows Server 2019 data center. And then we provide a local admin account for that specific server. And then we click on next, and then we can obviously select the VM size we want to use. We can also configure that differently if we want to have a different size. We can then select and add disks if we want to. And now we can go out and set, for example, the domain join permissions if we want to need to domain join that server. So we can do that too. And configure the networking part. So we're going to actually in and configure the network interface and networking. At the end, we're going to review that, and then we're going to create that Azure VM. This will then take a while, obviously, until the VM is created, but then it will also actually join that server to the domain, and it will also customize that server as well. So we can actually go out and everything is basically done for us. We don't need to do anything by ourselves. It really does everything for us. So now we will obviously need to provide the credentials for that specific machine. You can see here, this is our new create file server. So we provide these credentials we just entered. Again, we can use our domain credentials for this since it's a domain joined machine. And now we can decide, now your next step, we can decide, okay, which file shares do we want to migrate? So we're going to select all of them. And then we have a couple of advanced settings we can choose here. We can also say, okay, if we want to back up any folders that will be overwritten, for example, or do we want to overwrite that? So we're going to do that. And then we can again run a validation to make sure that everything is ready. And we can then start the transfer for that file server migration. Now again, this will take a little bit of a moment until everything is done. And now when it's done, we can actually go and do the cutover. This is basically an optional step in a case where we want to take over the identity of that server. So we're basically closing that scenario. So what we can say here is we don't want to take over the IP address because we want to keep that IP address our Azure VM has. We can then go to the next step and actually check what do we have here. So let's quickly connect to that server. And you can see, if we scroll down here, we can go and have a look at the files there. We want to make sure that everything is there and the file shares are there. So if we now go to the C drive, we have them on the C drive here. You can see here that we have alpha, beta, and gamma. These folders are created. And if you go to the file shares, you will also see that the file shares are here on that server. So everything is already done for us. And these file shares are already migrated to that server. Now, what we can do to finalize that, we can take over the identity of that new server. So we can that it actually takes over the same name of that server. So that means that it removes the name of the old server or the original server, change that to a random name if we want to, or something we want to configure. And then it can actually take over the name and change the name of the new server. So all the file servers which are using the server name still actually work. So that was a quick demo about the storage migration service. Again, there's much more to be discovered in that demo. But again, this is an easy way to migrate your file servers to Azure. So we talked a lot about the migration, and now we actually migrated our servers and services to Azure. However, this is now an ongoing process to actually optimize these resources after the migration. Again, same thing as if you would create new stuff. You also want to keep on optimizing that. So always have a look that you right size your Azure VMs, that are configured in the right size, maybe some performance data changing, and obviously in the cloud, this definitely makes a difference. For the migration itself, this is also something you can check before, but you can also do that in a later point. See if you have license available for the Azure Hybrid benefit. So you can use your existing, for example, Windows Server or SQL licenses in Azure, and you don't pay for them basically twice. And then also have a look at Azure Reserved instances to actually save money. With Azure Reserved instances, you're basically committing for running a server 1 or 3 years, and you still pay monthly, but with the commitment, the prices of these servers or the costs go way down because you did that commitment. After you move your VMs, also have a look, as I mentioned, a tool like Azure Cost Management, which will help you discover where are the costs coming from, and use a tool called Azure Advisor. This will give you built-in best practices, recommendations for your Azure services, not just VMs, but it will help you to discover availability issues, security issues, performance issues, or cost recommendations to like optimize your spending. And then obviously think about modernizing these workloads, right? A lot of these workloads which are probably running today in virtual machines maybe run on PaaS services or containerized or serverless applications, or we already offer a couple of tools as software as a service or PaaS for your platform. So also, like, always think about modernizing, making your environment more modern. I talked to this before. It's not just, when we speak about migration, it's not just about the tools to migrate, right? It's not just about the assessment. It's not just about actually doing the migration. There's a lot of other things involved in terms of people, processes, and technology. So you will always need to have that learning tool, and you will need to know what you're doing. How do I set up my environment? How do I build the processes right for the cloud? How do I do the migration? How do I do the governance? How do I make sure that it's secure? And then achieving that balance between giving that agility and speed the cloud offers, but still keep the control and so on, doing like governance and making sure you have that fast and efficient environment. Now for that, we have the Cloud Adoption Framework. And you can see here I have a link to that, which is a guidance we have with learnings from doing a lot of different migration projects about cloud in general. Again, it's not just about migration. It's also like, if you're using the cloud already, this also helps you to do the architecture, to help you with processes and best practices. And it also provides you with templates for your environment. So definitely check that out. It's a good way of starting that. And it also has a lot of different tools which will help you to do, for example, assessments to figure out where are you in your cloud journey and where do you still have to work to do. So in this session, you have learned how Tailwind traders can use Azure Migrate to actually do an assessment of their on-premises environment to find applications and dependencies running on their on-premises virtual machines and even physical machines if they want to. Also, how they actually can go out to migrate VMware VMs to Azure using IaaS or Azure VMware Solutions, how they can actually migrate different topics about Azure Migrate, migrating Hyper-V servers, migrating physical servers, environment. Also a link to the storage migration and a link to the cloud adoption framework where you can find all that guidance and a lot of information on doing cloud as an organization. So if you have questions, you can also connect with our team. Check out the links on itopstalk.com, where we again show different scenarios for IT pros and developers. And also, we are happy if you reach out and provide us with feedback with things which are working, which are not working. So please connect with us. In Module 4, we have learned how we can take advantage of Azure Migrate to assess our on-premises environment and plan our Azure migration. We also had a look how we can migrate physical servers, Hyper-V virtual machines, and even VMware virtual machines to Azure. We also had a look on how we can simply take file servers and file shares and migrate them to an Azure VM. Now we will have a 10-minute break. See everyone back for Module 5 when we start with migrating SQL workloads to Azure.
Hello there, I'm Victor Vargas again, Azure Technical Trainer Manager for US Southeast and LATAM. And now we're going to be talking a little bit more about how to migrate your data to Azure. We're going to be running some demos and examples, so you want to be on this class. Stay tuned and let's jump into the content again. So far, we are learning about the different options that you have when you are planning to migrate your data to Azure. Now, on this chapter, we're going to be doing an actual migration so we can see how that behaves on the toolings and how do we connect our on-premise machine to what we want to use on Azure, the SQL virtual machine that we have running in our subscription. The topics that we're going to be talking on this chapter is going to be to review again a little bit about the Azure data services, so we make sure that we all understand the different options that we have. We're going to be also getting to know other data migrations tools. We got familiar with one in the previous chapter related with data migration, but now we're going to get to know different options as well that we can use. We can do the Azure migration that we want to do. And we are also have a little glance of the migrations, the application migration service that you can find online to review your website and see if you can do a migration from that website to the cloud as well. It's going to be interesting. Stay tuned, please. So let's go and talk about the Azure data services that we have. As we talked before, we have three different options when we're planning to go to the cloud. We have infrastructure as a service mode in where we can use an SQL server on an Azure virtual machine to do the migration. We also have the platform as a service model in where you can use the Azure SQL managed instance and the Azure SQL database as components to do the migration. The Azure SQL Managed Instance is the intelligent, scalable cloud database service that combines the broadest SQL Server database engine compatibility with all the benefits of a fully managed and evergreen platform as a service. The Azure SQL database is a fully managed platform as a service database engine that handles most of the database management functions, such as upgrading, patching, backups, and monitoring without user involvement. Azure SQL Database is always running on the latest stable version of the SQL Server Database Engine and patches OS with 99.99% availability. In the SQL Server on virtual machines, we learned that we can run these virtual machines in different geographic regions around the globe, which is also a great option. And you can select the different machine sizes that you have available in order to meet your requirements. Also, the SQL Server on Azure virtual machines is going to allow you to have an automated updates running, automated backups, high availability, and excellent performance. Azure virtual machines offer different machine sizes to meet the various workloads and demands. SQL Server VMs also provides automated storage configuration, which is optimized for your performance requirement. For more information about configuring storage for SQL Server VMs, see the storage configuration for SQL Server VMs documentations. It's going to be plenty information there about all the different mixes that you can have for SQL servers running on Azure virtual machines. The other option that we learned was the Azure SQL DBs, in where it's going to be an always running on the latest stable version of SQL Server Database Engine, and is providing a 99.99% availability. It's a great option for your machine, for your migration. SQL Database can be the right choice for a variety of modern cloud applications because it's enabled you to process both relational data and non-related structure such as graphs, JSON, spatials, and XMLs. Keep that option in your mind when you're planning to have a past kind of migration. And the Azure SQL database managed instances, as we learned, are intelligent, scalable databases that can combine with different applications that you need. You can have SQL managed instances has near to 100% compatibility with the latest SQL Server Enterprise Edition, which is something that some organizations look when they are moving to the cloud their data. They also provide an native virtual network environment that implement the address for the common security concerns that any business model can have. Those SQL managed instance allow you to have existing SQL Server customer to just lift and shift their on-premise application to the cloud with minimal applications and database changes. At the same time, SQL managed instances preserve all the past capabilities like the automatic batching and version updates, the automatic backups, hey availability, that drastically reduce management overhead and TCO. Now, we also learned that there is some difference between SQL database and SQL managed instances. They have plenty things in common, but there is some little differences that you can take advantage on. The way the availability is managed in the availability groups is a little bit different. In the SQL database, you are going to have a 99.99% to 99.995% of availability. In a managed instance, only 99.99. The backups comments are a little bit different because on the SQL database, only the system initiated the automatic backups, while on the SQL managed instances, the user can initiate some copy only backups to Azure Blob Storage, but you have that option there. Again, the SQL managed instance has almost 100% of compatibility with SQL Server Enterprise Edition, and that is going to be probably the reason that is going to move you to go to a managed instance. If you want to do no changes and practically a lift and shift of what you have with no changes at all or really few, while the SQL database is going to offer you more comfort and more options around, it's going to be probably requiring you to do some little changes that necessary. And maybe one of the big differences between the two is the cross-database transactions. For Azure SQL databases, we don't have that option available, but for Azure SQL managed instances, yes, within the instance. And for that, there is plenty information available to review in order to determine which of the two past options is better for your data migration project. And let's not forget about the other options. Not everything is SQL related. We all love SQL Server, but SQL also offers some other flavors that we can take advantage on the cloud, like Postgres SQL, MariaDB, or MySQL, that can help us to have some kind of refactoring or innovation in the projects that we are implementing. Now, Let's talk about the data migration tools that we have available. As we saw, there is some guides that you have available that you can use at any time. So maybe that's the first point that we want to refresh here. You can get details, step-by-step guidance about how to do your migrations with SQL Server, with Oracle, DB2, MySQL, PostgreSQL, MongoDB, Cassandra, MariaDB, even Access, SAP, or any other table storage that you are having on Azure that you can integrate in your migration strategies. So make sure that you get familiar with this documentation because it's going to help you very much. About the tooling, on the previous chapter, we learned about how you can use the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit anytime you need it. It's a simple software that you go and install, and you can get access to the inventory of the information that you need. It's fantastic when you are getting the responsibility to migrate plenty servers, and maybe you are not quite familiar with the details on each of those, so you don't know exactly what is there, which version is there, what sizes or databases are we talking here. Well, this is going to become your best friend. It's going to be an easy way to run that assessment. Remember to set the firewall properly in order to be able to extract the information that you need and put the firewall back to where it was after you are done. Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit is going to be a fantastic way to help you during your migration strategy. However, that is not all. It's not only about what you can assess, it's also the migration itself. And in the next demo, we're going to be learning how to use the Data Migration Assistant, or called DMA. This is going to help you detect compatibility issues that can impact the database functionality in your new version of SQL Server or SQL or Azure SQL database. If you want to check for any compatibility issues between the server that you are migrating from and the server that you are migrating to, this is the tool to use. Compatibility issues are typically the biggest cause of migration failures. The database migration tool enables you to perform and check your existing system on that. You can either make fixes prior to the migration, or you can plan to fix those post migration. The important thing is for you to know where the differences are. There is other tools that you can also take in advantage. For example, the SQL Server Migration Assistant is going to help you with those migrations related with SQL. It's a tool designed to automate the database migration to SQL servers from Microsoft Access, DB2, MySQL, Oracle, SAP. So it's a great tool to have as well, and you can use it for your migration when you are talking about SQL Server only. And finally, the database migration services, or DMS, is going to be a great way to manage your migration projects. The Azure Database Migration Services enables you to perform large scalable database migrations from within the Azure portal. Azure Database Migration Services integrated some of the functionalities of the existing tools, like the Database Migration Assistant, like the SQL Server Migration Assistance, and like the Data Experimentation Assistance that are going to help you to have a more comprehensive knowledge of what is going on your customer environment and maintain the highly availability solutions that you need. This enables you to streamline the process of the database migration and have a single place to effectively manage the execution of any data platform modernization project. And you can do this on many flavors: SQL Server, MySQL, Oracle, DB2, MongoDB. But perhaps the biggest benefits of these services is the ability to provide near to zero downtime on the data sources that enable live database migrations. This enables you to speed up the database migration process with minimal disruptions, although you also have the ability to perform offline migrations if you wish to do it that way. So pretty much this tool is putting together all the rest that we have that we can run on the server level and do the migration directly from the Azure portal. You want to use this service again when you have large projects to manage. For mostly scenarios in where you need to migrate one or a few databases, the Azure Migration Assistant is going to be a great tool for you to use as well. So options are in the table, and that's good because that allows you to set the best path for success for your particular data migration project. All that being said, I think it's important for us to start using these data migration tools that we have available. And let's start with the Data Migration System, DMA. With this one, we're going to be able to do an assessment now about the potential impacts that we can have in the migration process that we are planning to do. For that, we will go back to the demo environment that we were using in our previous data migration chapter and keep the migration going from there. As you remember, in the previous chapter, we were able to create a resource group in where we were having all our resources related with this migration. The SQL migration demo 01 was the one that we created. We did the Azure virtual machine right here, and right here we have an SQL server running on that machine. We also have all the disk and different artifacts that these environments require, and we created a storage account that I mentioned to you. We're going to be needing this one in order to synchronize the backup process from the local machine, the one that we are about to migrate, to this one, which is the machine that is going to receive the new database on Azure. So this is what we have so far. Let's keep running this demo deeper to see what can we do. Let me go back to the London machine that we were working before. On this one, as you remember, this is the London machine that we were using before, and a machine that is not connected to our environment. And right there, what we did before was to run the assessment to get the different toolings that we need to understand what was happening on this machine. Let me go back to the machine right there. So we have the machine there. Now what we want to do is we're going to be opening the data migration assistance that happens to be already installed on this machine. However, you can get it at any time that you need, and the machine is going to automatically check for updates when you need it. In order for look to this tool, in case you don't have it pre-installed in your environment, you only need to go to your favorite explorer and put the Microsoft Data Migration Assistance, and you are going to get access to the tool for download and execution. I'm going to go ahead and install the tool. I'm going to set the agreements that it has. I'm going to install this one, and I'm going to wait for the installation to be done. Once we finish with the installation, I'm going to check this one right here. So get launched as soon as I click the finish button right here. Very good. This is the data migration assistance. And you have a couple of options when we're talking about this tool. You can do an assessment with it, and you can actually do the migration with the tool. And we're going to be doing both things on the demos today on these chapters. But let's begin with the assessment right here. So the first thing that I want to see is the different targets that I have. As you see, I have the option to go to an Azure SQL database. I have the option to go to an Azure SQL database managed instance, to an SQL server on Azure virtual machine, or to any other regular SQL server that I want. So this tool can also be used on premise. If you want to migrate to one on-premise server to the other, if you have the right connectivity, you have the option right there. But now we're focusing on the cloud. So first, let's start saying, hey, you know what? I want to see if I can migrate this database to an Azure SQL database. I'm going to select that one right there. I'm going to do an assessment, and I'm going to call this SQL to SQL server, and I'm going to call this 01. Okay, so right here, SQL to SQL server, and I'm going to select that I want to go from SQL server to an Azure SQL database, and I'm going to create this assessment. I'm going to click next. It's going to ask me what the sources are. So first, I'm going to be working on this machine. This is the London machine. You can put the name of the machine, or you can put the local host, and that should work. I'm going to remove the encryption from the connectivity, and I'm going to set that I'm going to be using Windows authentication because I know the user and the password. I have the databases right here. So you see that on this machine, there is all these databases going on the SQL server. So I want to do that. I want to set add and select all of them for this assessment. And now I'm going to start assessment. The assessment is going to check two things for me. First, the SQL Server feature parity, and then the compatibility issues that you may face. As you see, this one right here is telling us that there is some sort of different issues that I need to work on. Nothing of this is fatal, by the way. These are easy to fix issues that the migration can produce, but now you know that in advance, and it's going to give you solid recommendations about how to fix the problem if you want to go for this particular migration. These are the different settings that he's telling you and the different issues that he's reporting with the different recommendations about it. You can also see, is there any compatibility issue on this migration? That assessment is running right now. As you can see, now the assessment for compatibility issues is complete, and we have no compatibility issues whatsoever to worry about. So if this is the kind of migration you want to do, you only need to deal with these issues reported on the SQL Server feature parity, and as soon as you get this fixed, you can get the assessment run again and get a new clean page if you are able to nail it. But now let's see what other options do we have. The other migration that we want to do an assessment is going to be from SQL to SQL virtual machine. SQL virtual machine. And I'm going to select right here that I want to go to an SQL server on an Azure virtual machine. By the way, we have one of these that we created in our demo before. So probably if this assessment goes well, we're going to be selecting this option for our real migration later on. But first, let's run an assessment to see how this one is looking. I'm going to go ahead and click next. I'm going to set the same thing. I want to connect to London. I have here all the databases that I want to assess. And now I'm going to start the assessment. As you can see, the assessment is done now. We have no compatibility issues to worry about. So our strategy to move this SQL server living on this machine to an Azure SQL virtual machine makes sense and could be a really good option for this migration. But now let's do one more. Let's go to assessment and let's say, hey, I want to do SQL to SQL manage instance and see how that assessment goes for me. So I'm going to select database manage instance here, and I'm going to create this new assessment type. We're going to be checking for compatibility issues, and then we're going to click next. We're going to be selecting the same machine, the same set of databases, and now we're going to be running the assessment in case that we want to do this on an SQL managed instance. So let me click start. That was super quick. So we have no issues to worry about from the SQL Server feature parity. What about the compatibility issues? Let's take a look. At this point, the assessment for the compatibility issues runs successfully, and we have nothing to worry about. So this is another viable migration for us, both going to an Azure SQL managed instance if we want to go to a more PaaS environment, or we can go to an Azure SQL running on a virtual machine if we want to have a more ES migration. The two options are available to us at this point. With this, we did the migration, or we did the assessment to do this migration. Let me go back to our slides in order to see what else we have there, because what is pending now is to do the final migration. But for that, we need to understand some concepts that is important to talk about before we do it. First, Azure Migrate is going to help us then to work as a central hub for database migrations. As you saw, we have some tools that we can use on the server that is going to be migrated, and then we can manage from there the migration, or we can also have the option to do an Azure migration project and manage the whole migration from the Azure portal. Both options are viable. Maybe the difference is going to be that you want to use an Azure migration project from the portal when you are managing large migrations and you are connecting many environments together that you want to have, and you need to have more control over the complexity that that could bring. For regular migration from single or few databases, using the tools on the server are going to help you as well to do a quick migration. In Azure Portal, you need to follow the necessary steps in order to create the instance for an Azure database migration service and then run the migration from there. It's going to be a service that is available to you anytime that you need it. We also learn at this point that we have multiple scenarios. That's why you have many options that you can go. There is many things that we need to take in consideration. Sometimes we're going to be working on Windows servers, but sometimes the databases are going to be running on Linux, and we need to make the integration of that. We are going to have SQL databases for sure, but there is plenty of non-SQL databases that could be integrated on the migration. You also need to assess what is going on with the web application that is probably using any of these databases. And at the end of the demo today, I'm going to be showing you the app migration service that you have online in order to do an initial assessment for that. We need to take in consideration if is there any virtual desktop environment, any big data boxes that we need to take care of, or even if we are talking about migrating environments running in VMware or in Hyper-V, or if it's really a physical server what we are migrating. In addition to that, we can do this integrating these services for migration on premise, but you can also migrate whatever you have in AWS to Azure or in GPC to Azure, and it's possible to do through these tools. That's why you have so many options, and that's why it's important to use the different guidelines that is going to take you step by step in any of those migrations. It's important to use some sort of framework when you're talking about migrating data, because it's not just about the velocity of the migration, it's about the availability of the applications that require that data and the security on the data while is migrating and when is migrating and living in the new repository. Your first task is to plan your company migrations to Azure strategy. You need to put together a plan to present to your leadership team to get the support and approvals. And in every situation is different. And that's why you need to get different tools that allow you to explain what is going to happen and how it's going to happen. You can use a framework of assess, then migrate, optimize, and monitor what is going on as a path for migration. Each stage is focused on particular aspects of ensuring the successful of your migration. And that's why we want you to learn the different options. And that's why we want you to understand the different mix that you can do from databases, and not only SQL, but also non-SQL environments. Because all together is going to tell you what is going to be the best strategy to follow when you are doing your migration. Because of the complexity in the migration processes and the different scenarios that you can face, is plenty information that you can use to make the best decisions. In this slide, we're going to be finding several links to Microsoft official documentation that you can use in the path to migrate your data and to be successful on that one. Take a moment to visit those websites, make them favorites for you if you are responsible for data migrations, because right there you are going to find gold information about how to do a migration successfully, integrating the different variables that your scenario includes. But now we talk about how to assess, we talk about the different options to migrate. I think it's clear for all of us at this point the different options as IaaS and PaaS and the different responsibilities that we have as users and owners of the data for every of those options that we learn. We learn as well that you can do this with different toolings that you can install on the server to be migrated and from there migrate the data to Azure. But we also learned that these tools are being integrated now in an Azure data migration tooling that allow you to manage the whole migration from the portal when this one is complex and large enough in order to use that mechanism. For a few databases, you are going to be want to use, for example, the data migration assistance to get the migration done. And we're going to keep the demo that we were doing at this point. Let me go back to the environment that we are building together so we can continue with our demo. As you remember, at this point, we have access to this London machine that we don't have Active Directory access to it, but we know who is the user and password for the administrator, and we were able to connect to the machine because we did the proper firewall configuration in order to be here. And we've run already a couple of tools. We learned first that we can go and run the Microsoft Assessment Toolkit in order to determine what components are in the machine and get detailed reports like this one, in when you can get all the different information and components of the artifacts living in your database, allowing you to understand better what is going on and to frame better what the migration includes to upper management or operations when you are trying to explain the reason why you want to do this migration. The second thing that we learn is that we can use the data migration assistance in order to, now that we understand what is running on the machine, that we can do different assessments in order to figure what is going on. At this point, we're going to be going to this machine and we want to do now a different thing. We don't want to do an assessment, but we want to do a migration. And there is certain things that we need to take care in order to do this properly. But I'm going to start the migration process wizard here, and we're going to be doing some little fixing that we need to do in order to allow the migration to be successful. To this one, I'm going to call migrate SQL to SQL VM demo 01. Okay, and I'm going to set this is going to be Azure SQL Server that I want to move to an SQL Server on virtual machines. And then I'm going to create this migration. And the first thing that I need to do is to connect to my local server. So I'm going to tell, okay, I want to go to London. I'm going to be using Windows authentication for that. And my target server for that, we're going to go back to our Azure environment. If you guys remember, just close this right here. Let's go to resource groups. If you guys remember, we have this resource group created. We have our storage account here that we're going to be needing in a minute in order to do the migration successfully. The backups are going to be living here, and both this virtual machine and the London machine needs to have access to this one. You remember that I copied some scripting before that we are going to be using in a moment here. So hold tight to that, and this is what we have. On this, we're going to click on the machine that we want to migrate. We don't have a DNS for this machine yet. So that could be a good idea to have right here. So let's go and configure the DNS. And we're going to be naming this. We're going to be using the same name, but given a full DNS. It's going to be adding the East US2 Cloud Apps Azure.com to my DNS. I'm going to save this one right here. Okay, so this is the machine that I want to have access to. I'm going to go back to the machine. Now, I'm going to refresh a little bit. So now I have here my DNS. I'm going to copy here into my magic notes. We're going to be needing that in a second. I'm going to copy that right here. And there is a few things else that we need to do, but I'm going to do it when they are necessary so you understand why we have to do that. Now we're going to put here the name of the server that we just have. As I don't have copy paste capabilities to this machine as simple, I need to use this tool. But now I have there the machine, and I know that I can connect to this machine using SQL Server authentication. And for that, I want to use the user and password that I created for this environment. It's going to be SQL admin right there. And this is going to be my password. Remove the encryption right there, and I'm gonna go next to see what happens. So now the assessment or the tool is trying to connect to say, hey, do I have access to that source and target location that you are saying? And that is exactly what is going to be validating. Let's wait. As you can see, we have an error right here on the top. There are validation errors in the source or target server. Please fix the issue and go to the next step. If I read more, I can get the details as you can see here. Invalid target server, details were specified for the migration, and network related of instance a specific error occur establishing a connection to the SQL server. The server was not found or was not accessible, and it's inviting me to validate that location. So as I know that I have access to the London thing, the problem is probably on the target server. And right there, I know what it is, but could be a really headache if you don't figure this out. Let's go to the Azure portal to see what could be the problem right there. This is the virtual machine that we were running right here. And as you can see, before we do this, as you can see, we're telling to this target server that we are going to access this machine through an SQL Server authentication. It's not a Windows authentication because I not necessarily want everybody to have access to the new machine, but to the instance I do. So there is a couple of things that I need to do to make that happen. For that, in the virtual machine that you are right here, if you go back to your resource group, this is the resource group that we created right here, all the companies that we have so far. I'm going to select the machine that I want. And then this is an SQL Server virtual machine. You are going to find this SQL Server configuration option right here. You're going to want to click on that one. And you want to manage your virtual machine a little bit in order to provide what you need. One of the things that we want to change is we're going to go here on security. We're going to change the SQL connectivity. As you see, is set as private. So only within the virtual network can be accessed through the SQL connectivity. That's why it's failing for us because that London machine, she's not part of it, that server is not part of our virtual network. So in order to make this possible, I want to make this public to the internet. So I'm going to be capable to connect to that SQL through the internet, through the port 1433, and I'm going to enable the SQL authentication. That is the authentication that I'm looking for to provide. And right here, I'm going to tell which is the user and which is the password for that instance that I want to use. Now that I have that, I'm going to apply these changes and I'm going to wait for those to be applied to my machine. Let's hold tight. As we can see, the changes that we did to the deployment happens already, and now the change occur in my environment. It is done. So let's go back to our London server to see if now we can get connected. We are using the same machine that we said before, SQL authentication, and we're using the SQL user and password that we defined. Let's close this one right here, and let's click next once again. Very good. So we were able to now connect to the source and to the target databases, and we can start the migration. But now we are in a really important point. This is telling me that I need to do my backup folders permission properly. I need to have both the London server and the target server with access to allocation in where they can manage the backup operation. So for that, what we're going to be doing is to configure properly the U drive as a map drive that we can use for this migration. I'm going to fix that then right away. One way to do it that I like very much is you can connect directly to your SQL Management Studio. So let's go to the SQL Server Management Studio and let's do a couple of tricks that I'm pretty certain you are going to love. Very good. Now we are in the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio on the London machine. We're going to be first connecting to the London server to see if we're able to see the databases right there. And there they are, all the databases that we are looking to migrate. Now, as I know that I can connect to the other server, I'm going to go here and establish a new connection. But this time, I'm going to connect to the server that we just created. Go back to the machine right here. And I have the DNS name that I needed. I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go back to the London machine to do what I want. Uh, we're going to go here and we're going to send this text to the machine. There you go. And then we're saying it's going to be an SQL authentication. The login is SQL admin, SQL admin. And the password, I'm going to copy the password right here. Very good. And I'm going to connect. So now I do have visibility of the Azure virtual machine database that is running on Azure for us. It's very cool. And right here, we don't have any database yet from the ones that we need to migrate. But my Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio is allowing me to see both. The reason why I'm doing this is because first, help us to understand what is happening right here. We are running this migration right here. We're about to tell where the backups for these two machines are, but we are understanding what is going on this one. And we are seeing both servers. We know that connectivity is not a problem, but we still need that sharing location in order to do the backups. So the first thing, I'm going to place my cursor right here in the London machine, and I'm going to click the new query tool or the new query button right there. So now we're going to be running a few command lines that we need here that I'm going to be sharing with you as a model. These are the commands that I normally run when I'm doing this kind of migrations, because this is going to allow me to tell to both SQL databases where they can find the backup share in order to save the information. This is a not, this doesn't change really often. To be honest, I use this line all the time, but you need to customize these two lines right here a little bit in order to adjust to what we are doing right now. So if you remember, when we created the storage account before, and for that, I'm going to go back to the Azure environment. I'm going to go back to our resource groups, to the one in where we have all the components. And we have right here the storage account that we created. You remember we did that, we did this in chapter 2 when we were talking about data. So now if we go here to the file share, and to the file share that we created right here, if I click on the three buttons, I click on the connect thing, I can tell to this tooling to help me out, being that in Windows, Linux, or Mac, to help me create that drive letter that I can use for this. And I like to use the letter U for this one. So I'm gonna put that, and then I'm allowing to share my storage account key, right? Because that's the way to connect. So I have this script right here that is gonna help me to customize what I'm looking for to do. So I'm gonna copy this one, and I'm gonna go back to that notepad that I'm working on, right? Old-fashioned notepad is really useful sometimes. So let me go back to that. It's gonna be this one right here. And this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go a little bit down this same file, and I'm gonna copy this new content. And I know this works, right? Because I use it all the time. The only need that I need is to change a little bit these commands to use the right location of the storage account that I'm using, and to provide the proper user and password to connect to that storage account, right? As you can see, this information right here do not match with this one right here, because this is from a previous run, and this is what we are doing right now. So this is all happening live for us. The first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this part, and I want to be really careful of what I copy and paste, because it is different the format right here. So I'm gonna go here and change this little piece to that. Okay, so we're customizing a little bit our machine. The other thing is the user that we know is this one right here. I'm gonna copy that. I'm gonna copy that right here, up to here. And now, and now we want to take that password, which is gonna be all this stuff until here. And I'm gonna replace that right here. So I have my right password for the storage account. And now I need to take this line as well, and I'm gonna paste it and replace this one right here. Once you are done editing your file, we did some little changes right here in order to bring from the query that we just copy pasted from before. We took that certain names that we needed in order to fix the script that we have. And once we have reflected the right storage account, the right user, password, and file share that we want to have, you can go and copy all these lines and go to the machine that you are working on. So I'm going to copy this and go back to our London machine to continue with the migration. First, I'm going to then finish the mapping to the shared drive that they need. So I'm going to click on the London machine first, and I'm going to create a new query from there. I'm going to copy what I brought from before. So it's going to be all this text. We're going to bring it to the environment. We cannot run all the commands at the same time because it's going to give you an error. So we're going to first go to enable the advanced show options. And then we are going to enable the XP CMD shell to be executed right there. So I select that and execute. Now I'm ready to run these lines that we brought from before. Boom. And right there, as you can see, we were able to connect to the storage accounts. We were able to complete the commands that we drive. And then we have the U drive already available for us that we can be using for our project. So this is fantastic. London already have access to the storage account. And not only that, to the file share that we need the backups to be living. Now let's do the same, but now to the machine that is living in Azure. I'm gonna copy this as it is, and I'm gonna click right here on the virtual machine that I have running in Azure, and I'm gonna set a new query, and I'm gonna put this right here, same code, and I'm gonna go here and run the first part, and then I'm gonna run the second part, and now I'm ready to run my commands, and there you go. This one already have it mapped in the U directory. I'm gonna now disenable the XP SIM shell, CMD shell from here, and I'm going to do the same on the other machine that I was. Okay, all good. We are connected. So if I go back to my migration assistant right here, he was asking to me which drive we want to use in order to do the migration. So it's going to be the U drive, the one that we want for that, the one that we just map. And this is all the databases that could be migrated. In order to make this a little bit more simple from the time perspective, I'm going to disable some databases that I'm not going to migrate at this time. And I'm going to stay with the main database for AdventureWorks and the data warehouse that they have right there. So now we can go and click next. Is going to gather and verify some of the metadata that we provided. And then we can start the migration right now. We can go and click on Start Migration. And this is going to take our two databases that we selected on this case to the migration to our new Azure SQL running on a virtual machine. It's going to take a little bit, so let's hold tight while the migration gets complete. As we can see now, the migration is complete. Both databases are now migrated to our brand new SQL server running on a virtual machine in Azure. The time that takes these two databases to migrate is reported right there, 5 minutes and 4 minutes each, and both are already on the cloud. And we can verify that. If we go back to our management studio for SQL and you refresh your connectivity to the virtual machine, we should now be able to see a couple of new databases that were not there before, AdventureWorks and AdventureWorks Data Warehouse. You can do the same for all the rest of the databases if you need it. You can do all the databases at the same time if it's possible as well. For the time perspective, we did only these two databases as part of the migration. Something also that is important is precisely that way that we use to do this migration is the same that you can do for anything else. You can export this result, or you can go back here and do any other migration in the same model. If you decide to do a migration to a different set instead of an Azure SQL server on Azure Virtual Machine, and you want to use managed instance or Azure SQL database, the process is going to be quite similar. The only differences are going to be around the connectivity that we're going to be doing to those devices or to those artifacts on the cloud. Now, let me go back to our presentation. With this, we conclude the demo for these two chapters. At this point, you should be able to see and to do an assessment on your machine. You can install different toolings in order to figure what is going on any server that you need to be migrating in order to determine what is the best approach to do it. We learned that you can do more deep assessments with the data migration assistance in order to determine if it's better for you to go to an SQL database, to an Azure SQL database, to an SQL server running on a virtual machine, or if you want to use an Azure managed instance. Once you selected your approach, there is different things that you need to do to make sure there is connectivity between the target and the source, mostly from the backup perspective, so you can get data moving across those databases. The other important factor right here to take in consideration is the velocity of the migration. Once you are properly connected, you are going to be able to do your migration quite quickly. And then you're going to need to do some little changes in your application if you want to use the new source of data or in your DNS in any way. Now, we want to give you the last piece of information in order to understand all the different pieces that are related with our migration. This is not necessarily data related, but definitely all the databases has front end applications that use those databases or feed those databases. So it's important to also understand how can I know if my application or my website is ready to be migrated and what things needs to be considered when that happens. For that, we want to introduce you to the Migrate to Azure Application Service. It's an uh, super easy to access application. You can find it online. We're going to be seeing a quick demo in a second, in where you can pretty much identify what you want to do or if your application is ready to move. This way, you can assess your site to get details report of all the technologies used and whether they can be hosted on an app service or not. Assessments start by providing a public endpoint, which is scanned to provide the details of all the technologies that are there, which are which are then compared to other sites hosted on app service to generate a unique, accurate assessment report for your site. This tool will tell you if your site framework and hosting model is fully supported for migrating over to Azure App Services. Start your migration process by downloading the migration assistant and follow the steps to migrate your app, which you got familiar today about it. So how this goes is quite simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open a browser right here that we can see together, and then we can navigate into the migrate services, which is this one right here. So if you go app migration, if you go, for example, and you put the app migration in your browser, so you go right here and you put something like Microsoft uh, app migration right there, you are gonna be finding that there is this website right here, which is Migrate to Azure App Service. That is the one that you want to access. It's the same that I have right here. So if you go here and you said, hey, you know what, my site, I'm gonna access contoso.com to see if this website is available to be migrated. You just click on assess, and then it's telling you your site framework and hosting model is fully supported for migration over to Azure App Services. Start your migration process by downloading the migration assistant and follow the steps to migrate your app. The reason why we're telling you this is because it's important to understand what is happening from the front end perspective in order to understand how do you want to migrate your data. And if you have the opportunity to move from a hosting standard model that you are using to use Azure App Services instead, then you are saving a lot of money right there. And that is going to help you to also justify the overall project that you are putting together. Also, you can get here plenty information about different artifacts on this configuration that you can use in the reporting that you need to provide to your management or to your security and operation teams in order to get support for your migration project. So this is the way to know if your website or if your front end application on the web is able to move to the cloud or not. Now, let's go back to our final slide for today. Again, learning this material is a big step forward, becoming a Microsoft certified. Microsoft has certification paths for many technical job roles, and it shows that you are keeping the pace with today's technical roles and requirements. Check out these related certifications and gain a new professional edge. What a fantastic day we enjoyed together today. We have the opportunity to learn about how to select, identify the best strategies to migrate your workloads to Azure, your infrastructure, your data, how to keep all of that secure. Keep the learning going. Many resources were made available to you during the classes, so we want you to keep learning and get certified if that's something that moves you as well. We are happy to have you again in any of our classes, but for now, it's time to say goodbye. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy your classes today. Bye bye.